Now, many years ago, a mummified hand went missing from a Tibetan monastery, allegedly a hand of a Yeti. Then recently, a finger of the missing hand was found. Matthew Hill presents a tantalizing tale of exploration, smuggling, and forensic science in Yeti's Finger.
I wore the same hat in the Westerns until it wasn't a very good hat to start with, and it sort of disintegrated. But I pasted it together with Scotch tape and everything, and I wore it for years.
What do Buddhist monks, a Hollywood film star, and a mysterious half-man, half-beast have in common? Well, quite a lot, it seems. I'm standing outside the front of the Royal College of Surgeons at Lincoln Inn Fields. Towering over me are the grandiose neoclassical columns of this medical establishment, which has been custodian of surgical standards for almost 2 centuries. But it's also been custodian of thousands of body parts, both human and animal, in its impressive but little-known Hunterian Museum. And there's one piece of anatomy which has not been on display ever since it was brought here for safekeeping more than half a century ago. I came across this mythological object just by chance during a visit to the Royal College as part of my day job, which is the BBC's health correspondent in the west of England. With me was Ian Redmond, a primatologist, and our first meeting 2 years ago was with Simon Chaplin, who was then the curator of the Hunterian Museum. He took us into the basement to see the hidden collection of 3,500 specimens from animals and humans, skeletons, body parts in glass jars, bits of bone.
We're standing in the middle of what we call the Crystal Gallery, which contains about 3,500 specimens of human and animal anatomy and pathology, acquired by John Hunter, a surgeon, anatomist and naturalist who worked in the 18th century. And he built up one of the largest private teaching museums, not just in London, but anywhere in the world. His interests were surgery, obviously, and human anatomy and pathology for teaching surgery, but also he had a much wider interest in the natural world and was intrigued, I think, by the comparisons that can be drawn between different animals and humans, something that was quite radical in the 18th century. So we're surrounded by his specimens, most of them still in alcohol, which is how he preserved them. So it's a wonderful scientific resource, but also a wonderful resource for talking about the history of science and medicine and the way in which people have tried to understand the world.
In front of us we have pickled in, presumably, alcohol. Is that a chimpanzee? You would know, Ian, wouldn't you? Is that a chimpanzee head?
Yes, it is. These specimens predate the discovery by science of the gorilla, which was only described in 1847. But the mountain gorilla wasn't even found until 1902, so just over a century ago.
But it wasn't the primates I'd come to see. It was a specimen that had only recently been discovered in the collection, hidden in a drawer for more than half a century, which had been left to the Hunterian by a Dr. Osman Hill.
Osman Hill, as I'm sure you know, is a very famous primatologist. When he died in the 1970s, he left his research collection, notes and specimens, to the Hunterian Museum here at the Royal College of Surgeons, which he'd been associated with. And the collection, which I have to say was in a bit of a mess when it arrived, was added to our existing collections. There was a rudimentary catalogue, but because many of the specimens weren't properly cleaned and prepared, there's never been much research interest in it. We're now kind of catching up on that backlog of cataloguing and preparation work and trying to make sense of what we've inherited from Osman Hill. And lo and behold, amongst the collection, there is a box containing a variety of things that are obviously linked to his interest in cryptozoology. Plaster cast of a footprint, there are hair and scat samples, and a finger.
The finger, that is what we'd come to see. So, Simon, we have the box. Just opening up the box now. And here we have the finger in a transparent plastic bag. The finger was curled at the end, dried, black in colour, about 9 centimetres long, 2 centimetres wide in the widest part, with a long nail. According to the notes with the box, it was taken from the hand of a Yeti from Pangboche Monastery in Nepal. The person who brought it to London was the explorer and mountaineer Peter Byrne, who's now 85 and living in America. I wondered if he knew that this possible Yeti relic was still in London, and if he would be interested in knowing that it had been rediscovered after all these years.
Yeah, Peter Byrne.
Oh, hello, Peter. It's Matthew Hill, BBC. Can you talk now?
Yes, good, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, good.
Go ahead.
It's just that I think I've discovered it.
Discovered what?
The finger.
Oh, no, really? Great heavens.
And I'd like to show it to you. Basically, it's in central London, and it's been there for decades.
Yes, of course, been there since 1961.
I just happened to have stumbled across it by accident.
Where?
Well,
Where?
I could take you to it. I could pick you up from Heathrow. Well, I'm waiting in Terminal 3 at the arrivals lounge for Peter Byrne, who's just flown several thousand miles from Portland in Oregon. Hopefully, I'll be able to reunite him with a long-lost object. Mr. Byrne, Peter Byrne, Matthew Hill.
Matthew, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. You're just here on holiday, are you?
Yes, here for a week.
Right.
And then back to the US.
Okay, well, I hope to take you to see something fairly intriguing, and I hope it answers your questions.
It's going to be very interesting indeed. I'm looking forward to that.
We went straight to the Royal College of Surgeons, and as we waited to see Simon Chaplin, the curator of the Hunterian Museum, I asked Peter to tell me how he obtained the finger. The story begins in 1958.
We were on a long 3-year Yeti expedition and moving through the Himalaya, and we found ourselves one day camped at a temple called Pangbochi. And the temple had a number of Sherpa custodians, and one evening I was listening to them and I heard one of them speaking Nepalese, which I speak. So we began to chat. We started talking about the Yeti, and then he told me that in the temple they had a hand of a Yeti which had been there for many, many years, and would I like to see it? And so I said yes, and we went up in the evening time, and by candlelight he showed me the hand, and that's how it all began.
And what did it look like?
Well, it looked like a large human hand. It was covered with crusted black, broken skin. It was very oily from the candles and the oil lamps in the temple. The fingers were hooked and curled. I seem to remember the forefinger had a long nail on it.
And what did you do then?
Well, I sent messages back to our sponsor, who was a Texan. It was a man named Tom Slick. And then he sent a message to one of the scientists who were working with us, and one of those was a Dr. Osmond Hill, who was prosector of the Regent's Park Zoo at that time. And he got a message to me, and messages went back and forth through India by cable with runners we sent up and down to the border. So it was a prolonged correspondence. It took 3 weeks to get a message out, get a message back. And he said, take a break and come and see us, come to London, and come and meet with me and Mr. Slick and some others here, and let's talk about this hand and what we can do. So I flew to London, and we all met at the restaurant in the Regent's Park Zoo at a luncheon.
So not far from here, really?
Not far from here.
And what was agreed at the meeting?
Well, what Osmond Hill said was, you've got to get this hand. We want to see it. We want to examine it. But I had already asked the lamas there if I could have the hand, and they said no, it would bring bad luck, disaster to the temple if it was taken out of the temple. So I told Hill this, and he said, well, at the least you should try and get one finger, maybe cut a finger off and bring it back, get permission from them to do that. And I said, I'd have to replace it with something. And he said, well, you can replace it with a human finger. And he reached under the table and brought up a brown paper bag and tipped out a human hand onto the table, which was several months old and fairly dried. I have no idea where he got it from, and we never asked.
But this was when you were having a meal?
This is when we were having a meal.
That's a weird thing to do.
And Tom Slick said, I take it that's not dessert. I remember him distinctly, him saying that. So I went back to Nepal with the human hand and sat down with the lamas and cut off one of the fingers from the Yeti hand and replaced it with a human finger. And I rewired the human hand by drilling through the carpal bones, and then I painted it with iodine to make it look the same yellow-black color of the original hand, and we put it back in a box, and that was how I got the finger.
The temple that housed the so-called Yeti hand was in a remote part of Nepal, but even then the monks charged travellers passing through about $1 to see it. So part of the deal to allow Peter to take a finger was that a donation was made to the temple and that the hand should still look complete. Once all the business was finalised, Peter now had to get it back to the UK. Easier said than done. It had to get through Indian customs without being discovered, otherwise it would undoubtedly have been confiscated. The expedition's sponsor and millionaire, Tom Slick, came up with a plan.
He said, take the finger to Calcutta and meet with a Mr. and Mrs. Stewart at the Grand Hotel. So I walked down across Nepal, got on a train, went to Calcutta, and arrived at the hotel, and then called the Stewart's suite upstairs, and Jimmy Stewart, the actor, said, come on up. So I went up and met them, he and Gloria, and I gave them the finger. And they were leaving in a couple of days, and they were going to smuggle it out of India. So they were a little bit worried about Indian customs. So Gloria hid the finger in her lingerie case, and they got out of India no trouble. So they arrived at the airport at Heathrow, and the lingerie case was missing. So they checked into the Dorchester, and it was about 2 days later they got a call from the concierge at the Dorchester saying there was a customs man who wanted to talk to them. So Jimmy said, send him up. So this young customs official came up with the case and gave it to them. And they made him sit down, have a cup of tea, and they talked to him because they were worried about what they might have seen in the case. So eventually Gloria got around to asking him, by the way, I noticed the case is still locked. And he said, of course, madam. He said a British customs official would never open a lady's lingerie case. So.
And did you ever try and find it after that?
No, I lost touch with Osmond Hill, and he died, and the thing disappeared.
And that is how the finger arrived in London, in the lingerie case of wife of actor Jimmy Stewart, to be given to Osmond Hill. But in a bizarre coincidence, Jimmy and Gloria Stewart's daughter Kelly studied primatology with Ian Redmond, and as they hadn't seen each other for years, we met up in London.
Hello, Kelly.
Ian and I were keen to know if she ever remembered her parents mentioning it. For example, was there anything in their diary from the time?
The only diary they kept while traveling was one that my mother started, and it had one line in it, and it said, left London for. And Dad was reading it, and he said, for what? Mom said, no, that's the time. Left London, 4 o'clock, and that was the extent of their diary writing when they traveled.
Do you think it's plausible that they might have helped in taking the finger out of the country?
It seems odd to me that they never mentioned anything about it, particularly because Dad loved telling anecdotes of adventures, and he could have really spun this story out. It would have taken him a long time to say abominable snowman, but I can imagine it. You know, so that part of it makes me think it didn't happen. On the other hand, I can imagine them being quiet about it because they were told that if they mentioned it, people would get in trouble, so they didn't mention it. And it just went out of their heads.
Do come along, Kelly. So here's the box.
So there it is. It looks like an old branch. Doesn't it look like a twig?
Well, it's a little bits of tissue that's sort of dried and sticking off.
Does it have a nail? So this isn't just bone. This has got dried flesh on it.
And a bit of skin. And you can see the fingerprint of her.
So this could be aged.
Kelly, can I ask, having come here today and seen what you've seen, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are it's pretty exciting to see this. And I'd just like to know more about what secrets this reveals. I want to know how old it is. I mean, my feeling is it's human.
Kelly couldn't shed any more light on the story, and we needed to know if the finger in the Royal College of Surgeons was the same one that Peter Byrne brought back to London. The only person that could do that was Peter himself. It was time to reunite them. Simon, hello. Simon Chaplin, the curator. This is Peter Byrne.
Hi there. Pleased to meet you. Oh.
So, Simon, as curator, you're obviously quite keen to show the finger to Peter.
Yeah, I think it's be nice to reunite you.
I'd like to, yes. I'd like to see it, certainly.
There's other stuff, though, isn't there? So, can you bring the box? Yeah. Okay.
So, the question is, does this look familiar?
Got a slight curl on the end of it, where the fingernail is on the outside.
Mm. Well, it's fascinating to see it after all these years, because we concluded that it had gone forever. So to see it after all this time is really fascinating.
Well, it's been quite difficult to get an anatomist to look at this sample, but finally we've actually found the professor of surgical anatomy here at the Royal College, Vishy Mahadevan, to have a look at it. Now, you know very little about this at the moment, deliberately so. Can you examine it, please?
Yes, so what I see in front of me is what looks like an articulated index finger, rather mummified, so I can't make out any of the soft tissue detail.
And do you think it's a human?
That does look like a human finger, and I'll tell you why I say so. I've got this articulated index finger, and there are two joints, and we call these the interphalangeal joints. And the distal interphalangeal joint is flexed, bent forward to a much greater extent than I would expect in a primate index finger. So I suppose by merely looking at it, I would say, without doing any radiological investigations, I would say that, yes, it's very likely to be a human index finger.
The only way, however, to be absolutely sure is to have the specimen's DNA analysed, but the decision had to lie with the College of Surgeons. Taking samples to test for human DNA from something old and small could mean destroying it altogether, because it would require taking quite a large section. Also, it had been handled many times and was bound to be contaminated on the outside by human DNA. So a request was made to a committee in the Royal College to take a sliver from inside the bone to test for non-human DNA, which requires a smaller piece of tissue. I went back with primatologist Ian Redmond to meet with David Jones, the head of the committee, to hear the result of their deliberations.
I think in general we would support that as an ethical thing, because it is important to know whether this is a human specimen or perhaps another primate. And we thought it reasonable that a small specimen could be taken, and we've defined an area from the bone which should be adequate for the testing. It would not disfigure the specimen, and we've agreed that that could be done under appropriate supervision.
Why is it important that we do this scientifically?
If it's a human remain, then that may have some implications for the place of origin, even though it may have been required in a reasonable way. It may be that the people at the monastery would be certainly very interested in whether this is a human remain or another primate. From the ethical point of view, and if we ever had to get into the process of repatriation, it would be important to have those ground rules clarified.
Now, Ian Redmond, you've joined me along the journey. What are your thoughts about that result?
Unlike many of the claims of Yeti sightings, here you have something concrete you can examine. So it's not just, do you believe this person saw something or not? You've got something there, you can do the analysis, and with modern forensic methods of extracting DNA, even if it is, as is suspected, more than a century old, we should be able to determine, well, whether it is or isn't human. If it's not human, and it's not a known species of primate, then that raises all sorts of interesting questions. The question of repatriation is another one, because whatever it turns out to be, if the monastery want it back, then, the Pangbosh monastery digit doesn't quite rank alongside the Elgin marbles, but it's the same debate. Should we have removed it? Should we keep it here? And should it go back?
While we waited for the DNA results to come through, I became aware of other interesting developments. Sometime after Peter Byrne took the finger, the whole hand disappeared from the Pangboche monastery. No one knows what happened, but it seems it went in the 1990s. But Mike Alsop, a New Zealand pilot and mountaineer, became aware of the story and was moved to launch a campaign to find the original hand. He's also made a replica, which he plans to present to the monks this summer, so that at least they have something to show visitors and regain just a little of the income they've lost. He's asking for any information about the original, pleading for the person who may have it to get in touch. I thought he might be interested to know about the finger.
Okay, well, we got some interesting news for you. I've managed to find the actual finger that he took out of the country.
Wow. Okay.
And it's been verified by him.
And verified by Peter himself. That's great
By
news.
Peter, he's seen it himself. In fact, it's lain all these years in the Royal College of Surgeons in the UK, and I only discovered this by chance on a visit there a couple of years ago.
Wow. What sort of condition is it in?
It's in good condition. Yeah, it's mummified. There's mummified flesh on it, and it's currently being analysed for DNA.
Oh, that's great news.
Can you expound a bit on your thoughts about that?
Well, for me, either way, if it comes back as it's human, then the mystery's been solved, and it's been a 60-year mystery, which is great. And if it comes back as an unknown species, well, then the mystery continues. So either way, it's pretty good for what I want to do, and is get visitors up to go and see the replicas.
And what do you think the effect will be of at least having part of the hand back on the monastery?
Well, I don't really know. I know Peter Byrne, when he spoke about it, and I've seen an interview with him, and he said when he asked for the finger, they said no, bad things would happen to the village if it ever left. And, just thinking about it, that village, they've had quite a hard time. You talk to the locals there, and everyone's lost somebody to the mountains, to Everest or to other mountains. Friends of mine there, his brother was killed on the mountain right out his back doorstep. Another one, his wife woke up a couple of months ago with a very large tumour on her spine. And it just seems there's a lot of hard things that have happened to this little village, and this might maybe give them some hope. Which is, they're very superstitious. So, they might really like it.
As the day neared for the results of the DNA tests, primatologist Ian Redmond mused on the implications.
The DNA is the final word. In terms of the shape, if it looks so much like a human forefinger that Professor Vichy considers it to be human, that suggests that if the Yeti is not human, it's a very close relative. So possibly another species in the genus Homo, which would really shake the world of anthropology if it turns out that there is another extant member of the genus Homo.
And now you are an expert on the biodiversity, the sort of habitats that primates live in. You've been to this area of Nepal. Does it make sense that if there were such a hominid, that they could somehow survive?
When I walked through the forests of the Himalayas, I was impressed by how many food plants in the same genus, if not the same species, that there are in the Virungas where the mountain gorillas live. But what I didn't see was any feeding sign, any plants that have been prepared and remains left over. When you follow gorillas, it's very clear where they've been peeling this plant or discarding the inedible parts of other plants. So I didn't see that. But certainly there are food plants and there are fruiting trees and bushes. So there is food there. And there are occasional signs, footprints, sounds reported, but here we have a concrete specimen, and the results of that DNA, if it proves to be non-human, will be earth-shattering, I think.
D-Day, or DNA Day, arrived, and Ian and I arranged to talk to Rob Ogden from the Zoological Society of Scotland, who did the scientific work at LGC Forensics Laboratory in Edinburgh. So, the moment we'd all been waiting for.
After a lot of analysis, we have concluded that the finger is from a human.
A human?
It's a human, yes.
Are you definite about that?
We are. We've got a very, very strong match to a number of existing human reference sequences in the international databases. So, yeah, there's no doubt that it's a human.
So, Ian, what are your thoughts now?
Well, that's interesting, perhaps a little disappointing, but I guess a number of questions spring to mind. does your DNA enable you to match what kind of human, what racial group the human came from? Or even whether it was an individual with some sort of genetic abnormality that might have led people to think, if it was an individual with unusual features, lots of hair all over the face, as some people are born with, would you be able to tell that from the DNA?
Not the particular DNA region we were looking at. Certain physical characteristics can now be traced back to a genetic origin, but this kind of science is still in its infancy. In terms of the geographic provenance or the geographic origin of the person, it's very similar to existing human sequences from China and that region of Asia, but we don't really have enough resolution in the data we have at the moment to be confident of a racial identification.
Now, Rob, that's, I suppose, solved this half-century mystery that we've been looking at. Yes, I'm a bit disappointed as well, but, I mean, at least we now know what it is, and we can hopefully get it back to the monastery where it came from.
Yes, that would be ideal. I also am a little bit disappointed. It would obviously be something of a finding if we found a brand new species and demonstrated the existence of a Yeti, but not this time. We'll have to keep looking.
It does beg the question, given that this is a religious relic that's been in a monastery perhaps for many centuries, what was it in the first instance that led these monks to think that this hand came from a Yeti? I wonder why it became this relic, if it was just a human hand. What's the story behind it?
It's certainly a good question. I think your comment earlier about perhaps it was somebody who had particularly distinct physical characteristics, perhaps even someone who'd come from a long distance away, maybe much taller and much hairier.
Ian, I sense your mind is kind of open to the possibility of Yetis, or at least it has been on our journey so far. Is it now closed?
No, I think a closed mind is not a scientific mind. You have to remain open. Being improbable does not mean being impossible. So open-minded always.
So there we are, a long trail taking in a remote Himalayan monastery, a Hollywood film star, and a crime forensics laboratory, and the mystery has been solved. The Pangboche finger is human. Now, apart from the monastery wanting it back, where does that leave us? Well, the sightings of Yetis continue. Kemerovo State University in Russia is this year setting up a research institute to look into the growing number of credible sightings of Yetis in Siberia, 15 in the last year. So, as Ian says, we must remain open-minded. But for now, the Himalayan Yeti recedes further into mythology.
Yeti's Finger was presented by Matthew Hill and produced in Bristol by Mary Colwell of the BBC Natural History Unit.